As I've said in previous videos, there's so much functionality built into modern DSLR and mirrorless cameras that we possibly overlook some of it. And multiple exposure is one of those capabilities that can be quite fun to use, and you can create some quite good images if you know how it works and you can really work it into your workflow. As someone who predominantly shoots RAW, I've tended to overlook some of this functionality because I tend to use my post-production tools to achieve certain effects that could be achieved perhaps in camera. So I've decided to have a look at multiple exposures. I started it off as a bit of a 2-minute tip video, and I know some of my 2-minute tip videos do extend up to probably 4 or 5 minutes. However, once I go over that level, I think it's a bit disingenuous to call it a 2-minute tip video. So as I've unpacked some of the functionality in the area of multiple exposure, I've realised the video would go probably significantly over that, so I've turned it into perhaps a bit of a longer form video where we're going to look at the settings, we're going to look at some of the options for doing multiple exposures, and we'll try out some of those to give you an idea and some inspiration perhaps. If you're not familiar with the multiple exposure technique, what it is you take a number of images and then overlay them on each other. So maybe you take a foreground image and you take a background image and you merge them together. Now you can do this in post-production in Photoshop, but equally there's capability in camera to do this, where the camera will take two images that you take and merge them together to create a third image. Before we get into some of the technique, let's take a look at the settings in camera. You'll find them in the photo shooting menu, and if you scroll right down to the second last page, you'll find them about midway down, and it's called multiple exposure. Before we dive into the menu system, you can use multiple exposures in camera with RAW shooting or JPEG. If you shoot RAW, then what the camera will do is combine the two RAW images but output to a JPEG image. So if we go into the option menus, what we find is the first option is multiple exposure mode, and here we can set the camera to shoot a series of multiple exposures, a single multiple exposure, and then revert back to normal shooting mode, or we can turn it off. The next option down is number of shots, and here we can set an option of how many shots we want to combine in camera, and this can be between 2 and 10 shots. So the next option down, overlay mode, is where we tell the camera how we want it to blend together the multiple images. And to help us understand the different options here, I've taken a couple of photos and merged them together. The first photo is of my morning coffee. I chose that because it's got some quite dark areas and some quite light areas. I then took a second photo of some neutral carpet, which is lighter in most areas but is a very neutral colour. And I got the camera to blend them together using the different modes. So let's look at the different modes. The first one is add, and here what the camera does is just merge the two images together or add them together without modifying the gain at all. Now what we mean by gain is the camera will look at the same pixel in the different images, and the gain is in effect the amount of light hitting that pixel. So the higher the exposure on that pixel, the higher the gain. And in add, the camera will just add the two values together. So what we can see is that the more images we add, the brighter the image, the multiple exposure image will get. It's a very straightforward approach, and the camera doesn't really adjust anything, it just adds the images together. If we go down to the next setting, which is average, what the camera does here is say that if you've got two images, the camera will divide the gain in the pixel in each image by 2 and then add them together. If you've got 3 images, it will divide the pixel in each of the 3 images by 3 and then add them together. So what you can see is it starts to average out the exposure in the final multiple exposure image to give you what it thinks will be a broadly average exposed image. The next setting, lighten, what the camera does here is it looks across the same pixel in each of the images and uses the brightest pixel. So you will see that where the carpet is brighter than the coffee, it is the pixel that is used, and where the coffee image has a brighter pixel than the neutral carpet, it uses that one. In the darken option, it takes the same approach, except it uses the darkest pixel from the images that you've taken. So here you will see that where the coffee is darker, it uses the pixels from the picture of the coffee, and where the carpet is darker, it uses those pixels. So I hope that helps you understand how the different blending modes work. And what you have to do is think about what are the two images you're going to be taking, and which one do you want to be more prominent or more foreground, shall we say, and which one do you want to be the more background image. So if we want to use multiple exposures quite effectively, we have to think about what's the end effect we're trying to create, and therefore what's the best overlay mode to achieve that. So this isn't really a point and shoot mode in a lot of instances if you want to get the best outcome from it. Moving down the options, the next one is keep all exposures. I think this is quite explanatory. It's just either on or off. So what this will do is if you shoot two images and combine them to be a multiple exposure, if you turn it on, it will keep the two images you shot to then create the multiple exposure one. If you turn it off, it will just retain the composite multiple exposure image. The next option down is overlay shooting, and what this does is, if you imagine when I was taking the picture of the coffee cup and the carpet, if I turn this on, then I take the picture of the coffee cup and then I move to take the second image. What I will see is a faint ghost image of the coffee cup overlaid on what I'm seeing through the viewfinder. So it's quite useful if you're taking one shot which you want to be a sort of foreground shot, and you want to compose it to be in a particular position over a second or third background shot. Or perhaps where you want to make sure that the two shots are overlaying in the correct way. Now, we don't always have to shoot sequential shots to create multiple exposures, and that's where the final option, select first exposure, comes in. What we can do is select a raw image we've already taken and is stored on our memory card, and select that image and then take a second image and overlay it to create a multiple exposure image. So when you go into select first exposure, what it will show you is all the raw images from your memory card, and you can just select the first image and then take a second image. So hopefully that's given you a good insight into the key settings in camera and what their impact is on the multiple exposure you're going to be taking. So let's look at some different scenarios whereby we might be wanting to take a multiple exposure. So let's look at what this means in reality. I want to, say, take a photo, a multiple exposure, where you've all probably seen the image of a person standing there and they move their arms, and the multiple exposures give them sort of a multi-handed or multi-armed look. So let's try and create one of those. Let's think about how we'd go about that. So if we come into our camera, and I've got this set to aperture priority, I've got it set to f2.8 because I want it to be a fairly shallow depth of field. It also pushes the shutter speed up, so hopefully it will just capture the movement in the shot. So if we come into photo shooting menu and we scroll down to multiple exposure, we come in, the first one I'm going to do is a single photo, so I'm going to capture one multiple exposure. So that's on single shot. I'm going to try and capture 3 shots, so I'll end up with 6 arms. So we choose 3 in the number of shots. So then we've got to choose overlay mode, and this is where we've got to think about what we're trying to achieve. Now, I'm going to be moving my arms in front of a background, and I want my arms to be the main part of the object of the image. I don't want them to be blended with the leaves behind. Now, my arms are likely to be lighter than the background, so I think we want lighten mode here because it will pick the pixels of my arm over the pixels of the background. So we set lighten, and we come out, and because I want to be in front of the camera and behind the camera, I'm going to have to use a little bit of inventive functionality in the camera. If I come to my I button And I come into shutter release and set it to high, then come back in and set it to timer release, and I want it to be 5 seconds, and I want 3 shots. So now when I push the shutter release, I've got 5 seconds to get there, pose, and then move my arms in time with the shutter. So let's see how that came out. Now that one worked much better because my arms were lighter. It's actually used those pixels over the ones in the background. What you get is the lighter pixels that are my arm fully, and the background is behind them. So that is probably the best approach. I think in the main that came out as I was expecting. A little more practice, I think. So practice makes perfect. I switched my shirt for a white shirt, and as you can see it came out much better. All I've got to do now is think about the background and perhaps find a darker background. It's really important to think about that contrast when you're planning your image. I hope you found this video on multiple exposure useful. I hope it's given you some inspiration to perhaps get out and think about what images you could take with a multiple exposure technique. If you enjoyed the video, hit subscribe, hit the notification below, and let us know in the comments how you get on with multiple exposures, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video.